In the quiet, picturesque neighborhood of Willow Pines, life moved at a slow and peaceful pace. The community was tucked away from the chaos of the city, surrounded by lush green hills and a sparkling private lake that shimmered under the sun. It was the kind of place where people came to escape their busy lives and enjoy a slice of serenity. But like any neighborhood, it had its share of personalities, some friendly, some nosy, and others just plain difficult. One such resident was Ethan Carter, a man in his mid-40s who lived alone in a modest home near the edge of the community. He wasn't one for socializing. You'd rarely see him at block parties or HOA meetings. Instead, he preferred spending his time tending to his garden, taking long walks around the lake, or reading books on his porch. To most of his neighbors, Ethan seemed unremarkable, a quiet guy who kept to himself. But those who knew him well, enough would tell you there was more to him than met the eye. For starters, Ethan owned several properties in the area, including a sprawling ranch that bordered the neighborhood's prized, private lake. The lake itself was a point of pride for the residents of Willow Pines. It was a place where families gathered for picnics, kids learned to fish, and couples took romantic evening strolls. But owning land near the lake came with responsibilities and rules. And no one enforced those rules more strictly than Curran Whitmore, the self-proclaimed enforcer of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Curran was, well, let's just say, she wasn't exactly beloved in the community. She had a reputation for being overbearing, judgmental, and downright impossible to please. If someone painted their fence a shade darker than approved, Curran would march over and demand they fix it immediately. If a neighbor's dog barked too loudly, she'd call the HOA hotline faster than you could say good boy. And if anyone dared question her authority, forget about it. You'd be lucky to make it through the week without receiving a strongly worded email, but despite her abrasive personality, Curran did have one soft spot, her teenage son, Jake. Jake was everything Curran wasn't: loud, reckless, and always pushing boundaries. While Curran liked to think of herself as the glue holding the neighborhood together, Jake was more like the loose screw causing trouble wherever he went. He skipped school, got into arguments with other teens, and generally made a nuisance of themselves. Still, Curran couldn't bring herself to discipline him. Deep down, she believed he was just going through a phase, even though everyone else saw him for what he really was, a spoiled brat. Now, here's where things get interesting. What Curran didn't know, and what almost no one else in Willow Pines suspected, was that Ethan wasn't just another quiet neighbor minding his own business. Unknown to the rest of the community, Ethan held a secret trump card. He controlled the majority of the HOA's budget. Years ago, Ethan had quietly invested in the association's funds using a pseudonym, ensuring that his involvement remained invisible. This meant that while Curran strutted around acting like she ran the show, Ethan actually pulled the strings behind the scenes. So when Curran approached Ethan one crisp autumn morning with a request, she had no idea she was stepping into a game she didn't understand. She knocked on his door with her usual air of entitlement, clutching a clipboard and wearing an expression that said, "You're about to do me a favor." "Ethan," she began without so much as a hello, "I've been thinking about the lakefront part of your property. As you know, my son Jake loves fishing, and I think it would be great for him to have access to that area. It'll keep him out of trouble and give him something productive to do." Ethan listened patiently, his face giving nothing away. He already knew where this was headed. Over the years, he'd heard plenty of similar requests from neighbors eager to use his land for various reasons. Some wanted to host events, others hoped to build extensions onto their homes, and a few simply assumed he wouldn't mind sharing. But Ethan had always been firm about setting boundaries. His ranch, and especially the lakefront section, was off-limits. "I appreciate the thought, Curran," Ethan replied calmly. but I'm afraid I can't allow that. There are safety concerns, not to mention liability issues. I hope you understand." Karen frowned, clearly annoyed. She wasn't used to hearing the word no, especially not from someone like Ethan. In her mind, he was just a regular guy who should feel grateful she was paying attention to him. Surely, he'd cave if she pressed harder. It's not just. For Jake, she continued, her tone sharpening. It's good for the community, too. Think about how much happier everyone will be knowing we're making full use of our resources. Ethan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He knew better than to argue with Karen when she was on a mission. Instead, he decided to play along for now. After all, sometimes the best way to deal with a problem is to let it unravel itself. "All right," he said after a pause, surprising both Karen and himself. "Let me draft something up and we'll see how it goes." Karen beamed, convinced she'd won. Little did she know, Ethan had no intention of handing over control, not really. The wheels in his head were already turning, plotting a course that would leave Karen regretting ever crossing him. Ethan's decision to play along with Karen's request quickly turned into a game of cat and mouse, though Karen had no idea she was the mouse. The next morning, he sat down at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and drafted a document. That looked official enough to fool someone who didn't read the fine print. It stated, in bold letters at the top, that Ethan was granting temporary access to the lakefront portion of his property for recreational purposes. But buried deep within the text were vague clauses about liability waivers, safety protocols, and conditions that made the agreement practically useless. He even left out key details, like legal signatures from witnesses or notarization things any legitimate contract would require. To anyone who bothered to look closely, it was obvious this wasn't a binding agreement. But Karen? She barely glanced at the paper before snatching it up with glee. All she saw were the words temporary gift and lakefront access. And that was all she needed to declare victory. Word spread fast in Willow Pines. By noon, half the neighborhood knew about Karen's supposed triumph. Some neighbors congratulated her on her persistence, saying things like, "Wow, you really got him to budge." Others whispered behind closed doors, wondering if this set a dangerous precedent. If Karen could convince Ethan to give up part of his land, what was stopping others from making similar demands? Jake, meanwhile, wasted no time taking full advantage of the situation. Within hours, he'd staked his claim on the lakefront area, setting up a beat-up old tent and declaring it his base camp. He strutted around like he owned the place, inviting his friends over for fishing trips and late-night hangouts. At first, it seemed harmless enough, a few teenagers having fun by the water. But as days turned into weeks, Jake's behavior escalated. What started as casual fishing expeditions morphed into wild parties complete with loud music, bonfires, and plenty of trash left behind. The once pristine shoreline began to look like a dump site. Empty soda cans, chip bags, and cigarette butts littered the grass. The air reeked of smoke from poorly extinguished fires. And then there were the noise complaints. Neighbors reported hearing shouts and laughter well past midnight, ruining their peaceful evenings. One elderly couple living nearby said they hadn't slept properly in days because of the constant racket. Karen, of course, dismissed every complaint that came her way. When another neighbor politely asked her to talk to Jake about cleaning up after himself, she snapped back, "Oh, come on. Kids will be kids. You should be happy they're enjoying nature instead of sitting inside glued to their phones." But when someone mentioned the damage to the HOA board, of which Karen was still an active member, she doubled down, insisting her son deserved some freedom. "This is good for Jake," she told them during a meeting. "It's keeping him out of trouble and teaching him responsibility. Besides, Ethan gave us permission. What's the big deal?" What Karen failed to realize, or perhaps chose to, Ignore was that these grievances weren't just idle chatter among neighbors. They were piling up against her and ultimately against the HOA itself. Repairing the environmental damage caused by Jake's antics would cost thousands of dollars. Cleaning up the shoreline, replanting damaged vegetation, and addressing potential fire hazards weren't cheap endeavors. And since Karen had endorsed her son's reckless behavior, she was unwittingly tying herself to the fallout. Ethan watched it all unfold with a mix of amusement and growing concern. At first, he found it entertaining to see how far Karen's arrogance could take her. Watching her march around the neighborhood, acting like she'd won some kind of battle, was almost comical. But as the damage mounted and tempers flared among the residents, Ethan knew he couldn't sit back forever. Something had to give. One Friday night, the tension finally boiled over. Jake decided to throw yet another party by the lake, this time bigger and louder than ever. His friends showed up in droves, bringing coolers full of drinks, portable speakers blasting music, and even fireworks, a clear violation of local ordinances. The noise carried across the entire neighborhood, waking people up and drawing ire from everyone within earshot. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Someone had called 911, reporting underage drinking and illegal fireworks. Officers pulled up to find chaos. Teens running around, bottles scattered everywhere, and Jake standing near the bonfire looking defiant. When one officer approached him to ask what was going on, Jake shrugged and said, "We're just hanging out. This is our spot now." Karen heard the commotion from her house and rushed to the scene, her face red with anger. "You can't do this," she screamed at the officers, waving her arms dramatically. "This is my son's property. He has every right to be here." The cops exchanged skeptical glances. One of them pulled out a tablet and checked public records right then and there. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "this land belongs to Mr. Carter. Unless you have a legally binding agreement signed by him, your son doesn't have permission to be here." Humiliated and furious, Karen stormed off, muttering under her breath about injustice and favoritism. She spent the rest of the night fuming, replaying the incident in her head. How dare Ethan let this happen? How dare the cops side with him? By the time Monday rolled around, Karen had concocted a plan, one that she thought would put Ethan firmly in his place. At the next HOA meeting, Karen stood up and launched into a tirade, accusing Ethan of harassment and demanding punitive action. She claimed he was deliberately targeting her family and trying to ruin Jake's reputation. Her voice trembled with emotion as she pleaded with the board to intervene. "This isn't fair," she exclaimed. "Ethan needs to stop bullying us and let my son live in peace." The room fell silent. Everyone waited to hear Ethan's response. Slowly, he rose from his seat, his expression calm but commanding. Without raising his voice, he addressed the group. "First of all," he began, "I want to clarify that I never granted permanent or legally binding access to the lakefront. The document Karen is referring to is incomplete and non-binding. Second, I've received numerous complaints about the damage caused by these parties, not just noise, but environmental destruction that will cost thousands to repair." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then, pulling out a folder filled with receipts, photos, and estimates, he continued, "Since Karen has consistently supported and defended her son's actions, I believe it's only fair that she takes financial responsibility for resolving these issues. After all, we're a community, and everyone needs to do their part." The room erupted in murmurs. Karen's face turned bright red as she realized she'd walked straight into a trap. Instead of exposing Ethan, she'd exposed herself, and now the entire neighborhood knew exactly who was to blame for the mess. Karen's world came crashing down in that moment. The once confident woman who strutted around Willow Pines like she owned the place was now standing in front of her neighbors, exposed and humiliated. her face flushed with embarrassment as murmurs rippled through the room. Some people avoided eye contact, while others exchanged knowing glances. It was clear to everyone, except maybe Karen herself, that she had gone too far this time. Ethan didn't gloat or rub it in. He simply sat back down after presenting his case, leaving the board members to process what they'd just heard. But Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat. Oh no, she still had plenty of fight left in her. As soon as the meeting ended, she stormed out, muttering under her breath about how unfair everything was. She refused to believe she'd been wrong. In her mind, Ethan was the villain here, a quiet, unassuming man who had somehow managed to outsmart her at every turn. Over the next few days, Karen hatched a plan. If Ethan thought he could get away with embarrassing her in front of the entire HOA, he had another thing coming. She rallied a small group of disgruntled homeowners who were tired of Ethan's low-profile ways. To them, he seemed aloof and disconnected from the community. Why should someone so detached have so much influence over their lives? Together, they decided to challenge Ethan's role in the HOA. Their first move was to demand transparency. They called for an audit of the association's finances, hoping to uncover anything that would discredit him. After all, how did a man who kept to himself end up controlling the HOA's budget? Surely there had to be some shady dealings behind the scenes. Karen led the charge, filing official requests and organizing petitions. For weeks, she pounded the pavement, knocking on doors and gathering signatures. She even started a WhatsApp group chat titled Hold Ethan Accountable, where members shared conspiracy theories and vented their frustrations. But when the audit results finally came back, they revealed something shocking. Not only was everything above board, but Ethan's investments had actually saved the HOA from bankruptcy during tough economic times. His contributions had quietly kept the neighborhood running smoothly for years. The auditor praised Ethan's financial acumen, calling him a silent hero of Willow Pines. The news hit Karen like a ton of bricks. Once again, her attempt to take down Ethan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of exposing him as corrupt, she'd inadvertently highlighted his importance to the community. Now, not only did she look foolish, but she also appeared petty and vindictive. Even some of her closest allies began distancing themselves from her, realizing they'd been dragged into a losing battle. Still, Karen refused to back down. Humiliation burned inside her like a fire she couldn't extinguish. Desperate for revenge, she took things a step further by filing a frivolous lawsuit against Ethan. She accused him of fraud, emotional distress, and harassment, all claims that crumbled under scrutiny. Worse yet, Ethan's legal team uncovered documents proving Karen had falsified previous HOA reports to cover up her own mismanagement of funds. Suddenly, the tables had turned completely. What started as a personal vendetta against Ethan had spiraled into a full-blown scandal involving Karen herself. Faced with mounting legal fees and the possibility of criminal charges, Karen finally cracked. The weight of her actions and the consequences they brought became too heavy to bear. One evening, sitting alone in her kitchen, she broke down in tears. All the bravado and bluster she'd displayed over the past months melted away, leaving behind a broken woman who realized she'd made a terrible mistake. The following week, at the next HOA meeting, Karen stood before the same group of neighbors she'd alienated. This time, however, her demeanor was different. Gone was the fiery defiance. Instead, she looked fragile, almost defeated. Clutching a piece of paper in trembling hands, she cleared her throat and began to speak. "I owe everyone an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I let my emotions get the better of me, and I crossed lines I shouldn't have. Ethan, I'm sorry for accusing you of things that weren't true. And to everyone else, I'm sorry for causing division and making problems worse instead of solving them. Her words hung in the air, met with stunned silence. No one expected Karen, the queen of self-righteousness, to admit fault, especially not publicly. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. Then, slowly, Ethan nodded. "Thank you for saying that," he replied calmly. "Apologies are hard to give, and I appreciate your honesty." But Ethan wasn't done yet. While he accepted Karen's apology, he knew the situation needed more than just words to fix it. Turning to the rest of the room, he proposed implementing stricter rules regarding lake usage and party regulations. These measures would ensure the neighborhood remained peaceful and protected moving forward. The board unanimously agreed, and the new policies were put into effect immediately. As the meeting wrapped up, Karen lingered behind, watching as people filed out of the room. She caught glimpses of disapproving looks and whispered conversations. It stung, but she knew she deserved it. For the first time in a long time, she felt genuinely remorseful, not just for what she'd done to Ethan, but for the way she'd treated others in the community. Maybe, she thought, this was her chance to start over. Meanwhile, life in Willow Pines began returning to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after such drama. The lakefront area was cleaned up, thanks to funds Karen reluctantly paid back. Jake, humbled by the entire ordeal, surprised everyone by volunteering with local conservation efforts. He started helping clean parks and plant trees, earning back a bit of the respect he'd lost. Though he still had a long way to go, it was a start. And Ethan? Well, he went right back to being the quiet neighbor everyone thought they knew, but few truly understood. Despite the chaos Karen had caused, he never sought attention or praise. To him, this was just part of living in a community. Sometimes, leadership meant staying in the background and letting others figure things out for themselves, even if it meant dealing with difficult personalities like Karen along the way. For Karen, though, the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding trust takes time, and she knew she'd have to work hard to earn back the respect of her neighbors. But as she walked home that evening, she allowed herself a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this experience had taught her something valuable, that humility and accountability aren't weaknesses, they're strengths. The fallout from Karen's public apology and the revelation of her mismanagement sent ripples through Willow Pines that no one could ignore. For weeks afterward, whispers echoed in driveways, at mailboxes, and during morning coffee runs. Some neighbors felt sympathy for Karen, recognizing how difficult it must have been to admit her mistakes in front of everyone. Others weren't so forgiving. They saw her apology as too little, too late. After all, the damage she'd caused went beyond hurt feelings. It had disrupted the harmony of the community and cost real money to repair. Karen herself was a changed woman, or at least, she tried to be. Gone were the days when she strutted around issuing orders or micromanaging every detail of neighborhood life. Instead, she kept to herself more than ever before, avoiding eye contact and dodging conversations whenever possible. Her usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a quiet vulnerability that made some people uncomfortable. It was strange seeing someone who once dominated the HOA meetings now tiptoeing around like a shadow of her former self. But change isn't easy, especially when pride is involved. Despite her efforts to stay low-key, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching her, judging her every move. She started second-guessing herself constantly. Should I water my lawn today? Will they think I'm wasting water? Can I park my car in the driveway overnight? What if someone complains? The paranoia ate away at her confidence, making even simple tasks feel monumental. Her teenage son, Jake, noticed the shift in his mom almost immediately. At first, he thought it was funny seeing the woman who used to bark orders now tiptoeing around like she was walking on eggshells. But as time went on, he began to realize just how much the ordeal had affected her. Karen wasn't just quieter, she seemed smaller somehow, like a balloon slowly losing air. And while Jake wasn't exactly known for being sensitive, even he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Maybe, just maybe, his behavior had played a role in bringing her to this point. Jake's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was noticeable nonetheless. After the lakefront fiasco and the subsequent cleanup effort, something clicked. In his mind, he'd always resented authority figures, teachers, cops, anyone telling him what to do, but witnessing the mess he'd created forced him to confront the consequences of his actions. For the first time, he understood that freedom came with responsibility. That realization hit him hardest when he joined a local conservation group. Partly out of obligation, Ethan had suggested it as part of the reparations, and partly out of curiosity. At first, Jake approached the volunteer work half-heartedly, showing up only because he had to. But as he spent more time planting trees, picking up trash, and learning about environmental preservation, he discovered a sense of purpose he'd never felt before. The adults leading the group treated him with respect, not because of who his mom was, but because of the effort he put into the work. Slowly but surely, Jake began earning back the trust he'd lost. Neighbors who once rolled their eyes at the mention of his name now nodded approvingly when they saw him hauling bags of garbage away from the lake. Back at home, Karen watched her son's gradual redemption with a mix of pride and regret. Pride, because Jake was finally stepping up and taking responsibility for his actions. Regret, because she knew she'd failed him as a parent. Looking back, she realized she'd spent years excusing his bad behavior instead of addressing it head-on. By shielding him from accountability, she'd inadvertently set him up for failure. Now, seeing him grow into a better version of himself, she wondered what kind of relationship they might have had if she'd taken a firmer stance earlier. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to live his quiet life, seemingly unaffected by the drama that had unfolded. To outsiders, he appeared unchanged, still tending to his garden, still taking long walks by the lake, still keeping to himself. But those who paid close attention noticed subtle differences. For one, Ethan became slightly more engaged with the community. He attended a few HOA meetings, offering practical advice on budgeting and maintenance. He also struck up casual conversations with neighbors, asking about their families or sharing tips on gardening. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that he cared about Willow Pines not just as an investor, but as a resident. One evening, Karen found herself standing outside Ethan's house, clutching a plate of homemade cookies. She hesitated. For a moment, unsure whether knocking on his door was a good idea. They hadn't spoken directly since the HOA meeting where she'd apologized, and she worried he might reject her attempt at reconciliation. But deep down, she knew she needed to try. Taking a deep breath, she knocked gently. Ethan answered the door, looking mildly surprised but not unwelcoming. "Karen," he said evenly, "what brings you here?" Karen stammered, suddenly feeling nervous. She thrust the plate of cookies toward him. "I baked these. Thought I'd bring them over as a thank you for accepting my apology, Ethan studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "That's very kind of you. Thank you." An awkward silence followed, during which Karen shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. Finally, she blurted out, "Look, I know I messed up big time. Not just with you, but with everyone. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, and I want to make things right. If there's anything I can do to help the community or to prove I'm serious about changing, I'll do it." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Change takes time, Karen, and actions speak louder than words, but I appreciate your honesty. Keep working at it and people will see the difference." His words weren't warm or overly encouraging, but they carried weight. Karen left his doorstep feeling a glimmer of hope, not because Ethan had forgiven her completely, but because he'd acknowledged her effort. That small gesture meant more to her than she could put into words. Over the next several months, Karen threw herself into improving the neighborhood. She organized a community garden project, coordinated a neighborhood cleanup day, and even helped plan a family-friendly event at the lake. These initiatives weren't perfect. There were hiccups along the way, but they showed her willingness to contribute positively. Slowly but surely, her relationships with her neighbors began to mend. As for Jake, his newfound sense of responsibility extended beyond volunteering. He started helping Karen around the house, fixing things that needed repair and pitching in with chores. Their bond grew stronger, built on mutual respect rather than excuses. One day, while they were painting the fence together, Karen turned to him and said, "You know, I'm proud of you, kiddo. You're turning into a fine young man." Jake smirked, pretending to brush off the compliment, but inside he felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he believed her. And so, life in Willow Pine settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm marked by lessons learned and bridges rebuilt. The scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, but they served as reminders of resilience and growth. Through it all, one truth remained clear. Even in the most peaceful communities, conflict can arise. But how people choose to handle it defines who they are and who they become. Months passed, and Willow Pines began to feel like a different place altogether. The scars of the past were still their faint reminders etched into the fabric of the community, but they no longer dictated daily life. Instead, they served as lessons learned, cautionary tales whispered between neighbors over cups of coffee or during evening walks by the lake. The neighborhood had weathered its storm, and while it wasn't perfect, it was stronger for it. Karen's transformation continued to unfold in small, incremental ways that added up over time. She became more mindful of her actions, choosing her words carefully and listening more than she spoke. Gone was the brash woman who bulldozed through conversations with demands and accusations. In her place stood someone quieter, humbler, and far more reflective. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when old habits crept back in, but she caught herself each time, taking a deep breath and reminding herself of how far she'd come. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors who had once rolled their eyes at her antics now greeted her warmly, some even stopping to chat about the latest HOA updates or upcoming events. One day, as Karen watered her flowers in the front yard, an elderly couple from down the street approached her. "You've really turned things around," the woman said kindly. "We're glad to see you sticking with it." Karen smiled, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you," she managed to say. "That means a lot." It wasn't just idle praise. People genuinely appreciated the changes she'd made. Her community garden project had been a huge success, bringing together residents of all ages to plant vegetables, herbs, and flowers. The shared effort created bonds that hadn't existed before, fostering friendships and cooperation. Even Jake got involved, surprising everyone including himself with his green thumb. Together, mother and son worked side by side, planting rows of tomatoes and basil, laughing as dirt smeared across their hands. Jake's journey of redemption paralleled his mom's in many ways. He wasn't suddenly a model citizen overnight, but he was trying, and that counted for something. His volunteer work with the conservation group opened doors he never knew existed. For the first time, adults treated him not as a troublemaker, but as someone capable of contributing positively. That respect motivated him to keep pushing forward. Even when things got tough. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan spotted Jake carrying bags of trash away from the lakefront area. The teenager looked sweaty and tired, but there was a sense of purpose in his movements, a determination Ethan hadn't seen before. When Jake noticed him watching, He gave a sheepish wave. Ethan nodded in acknowledgement, then called out, "Good job out here." Jake grinned, clearly pleased with the compliment. "Thanks, trying to make up for, everything." Ethan chuckled softly. "You're doing better than most would in your shoes. Keep it up." Moments like these reminded everyone that forgiveness wasn't just about saying sorry, it was about proving you meant it through consistent action. And Jake was proving it every single day. As for Ethan, he remained the quiet backbone of Willow Pines, content to let others take the spotlight while he worked behind the scenes. Yet his subtle involvement didn't go unnoticed. People started seeking his advice on everything from landscaping tips to financial planning. He offered guidance without ever imposing, earning the trust and gratitude of those around him. Some wondered aloud why such a generous man chose to stay so low-key, but most simply accepted it as part of who he was. The lake itself became a symbol of renewal for the community. Once littered and neglected, it was now pristine, its shores lined with native plants and benches where families could sit and enjoy the view. A plaque installed near the entrance read, **, dedicated to the spirit of teamwork and resilience. Though unspoken, everyone knew it was a nod to the challenges the neighborhood had overcome and the brighter future ahead. Even Karen found solace by the water. On quiet evenings, she'd walk along the shoreline, watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Those moments gave her clarity, helping her process everything she'd been through. She realized that life, much like the lake, required balance. Too much interference disrupted its natural flow, but neglect left it vulnerable to decay. Finding harmony meant respecting boundaries, not just those of others, but also her own. One crisp autumn morning, the entire neighborhood gathered for a special event, the unveiling of a new gazebo built near the lake. Funded by donations and constructed with volunteer labor, it stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people worked together. Karen stood beside Jake, both of them smiling proudly as Ethan stepped forward to cut the ribbon. "This is more than just a structure," Ethan said, addressing the crowd. "It represents unity, perseverance, and hope. We've faced challenges, but we've grown stronger because of them. Let this be a reminder that our community thrives when we support one another." Applause erupted, echoing across the water. Karen felt tears prick her eyes as she clapped along with everyone else. For the first time in years, she truly felt like she belonged, not because of her position or authority, but because of the connection she'd rebuilt afterward. As people mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Karen pulled Ethan aside. "I owe you a lot," she admitted quietly. "Not just for accepting my apology, but for showing me how to do better. I'll never forget that." Ethan smiled, his expression warm yet measured. "You don't owe me anything, Karen. You did the hard work yourself. All I did was point you in the right direction." His words stayed with her long after the celebration ended. They reminded her that true leadership wasn't about control or dominance. It was about guiding others toward growth and understanding. And though she still had a long way to go, she finally felt like she was on the right path. In the weeks and months that followed, life in Willow Pines returned to its peaceful rhythm. The lake shimmered under the sun, children laughed as they chased each other around the gazebo, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves from their porches. Beneath the surface of this tranquility lay stories of pride, consequences, and redemption, a tapestry woven from the threads of human experience. For Karen, the lesson was clear. Humility wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. For Jake, it was responsibility, not freedom, that brought fulfillment. And for Ethan, it was proof that sometimes the best way to lead was from the shadows, letting others shine while ensuring the foundation remained strong. Willow Pines would always have its quirks and occasional conflicts, but one thing was certain: its heart beat stronger than ever. And beneath the tranquil surface of its pristine lake lay a story of resilience, of beneath the sorinju avejum lighting dunes a surface of its pristine lake lay a story of resilience, of faith in the fardhi the serene lots preserve of Elida, tale reminding everyone that appearances can be deceiving and that growth often emerges from struggle. Life moved on, as it always does. But the echoes of change lingered, shaping the community in ways no one could have predicted.